I'd had enough. The studio felt like a pressure cooker, and if I had to listen to one more entitled pop princess whine about her artistic vision, I was gonna lose it. So I did what any sane-year-old music producer would do. I grabbed my camping gear and hightailed it to the hills outside Huntington Beach. The sun was setting as I pulled into the campground, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. I found a secluded spot, away from the few other campers, and started setting up my tent. The familiar routine of hammering stakes and unrolling my sleeping bag helped ease the tension in my shoulders. As night fell, I lit a small fire and poured myself a generous glass of whiskey. The crackling flames and chirping crickets were a welcome change from the endless looping of auto-tuned tracks. I closed my eyes, savoring the moment of peace. That's when I heard it, a haunting melody floating on the night air. The voice was raw, untamed, and absolutely captivating. I found myself drawn to it, like a moth to flame. Grabbing my whiskey, I followed the sound to a nearby campsite. There she was, bathed in the warm glow of her own campfire. A young woman, maybe mid-30s, strumming an old guitar. Her long blonde hair fell in waves around her face, and even in the firelight, I could see her eyes were a piercing blue. She looked up as I approached, her fingers never missing a beat on the strings. "Sorry to intrude," I said, holding up my glass in a kind of awkward toast. "I couldn't help but overhear. You've got one hell of a voice." She smiled, and damn if it didn't light up the night more than any fire could. "Thanks," she replied, her voice a bit husky from singing. "I'm Sydney. Care to join me?" I didn't hesitate. "Nora," I introduced myself, settling down on a log across from her, "and I'd love to." We talked for hours, the conversation flowing as easily as the wine she shared. Sydney was an aspiring singer-songwriter, trying to make it in the cutthroat world of the music industry. I found myself opening up about my own experiences, the highs and lows of producing hit records and dealing with difficult artists. As the night wore on, our stories took a more personal turn. We both had our share of relationship disasters, cheating exes, manipulative partners, the works. There was something about the anonymity of the darkness and the warmth of the fire that made it easy to bare our souls. "You know," Sydney said, her eyes reflecting the dying embers, "I've always been attracted to women, but I've never really acted on it. Too scared, I guess." My heart skipped a beat. "Well," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, "maybe you just haven't met the right woman yet." Our eyes locked, and for a moment, I swear time stood still. There was an electricity in the air that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. Sydney bit her lip, a gesture so innocently seductive it took my breath away. "Maybe I haven't," she whispered. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, we finally said goodnight. But as I crawled into my sleeping bag, I knew sleep would be impossible. My mind was racing with possibilities, with the memory of Sydney's voice, her laugh, the way her fingers moved over the guitar strings. For the first time in years, I felt alive, and terrified, and exhilarated. Whatever was happening between us, I knew one thing for certain: my life was about to change in ways I never could have imagined. The next morning, I woke up with a pounding headache and a mouth that tasted like I'd been licking a campfire. But even through the hangover haze, I couldn't stop thinking about Sydney. Her voice, her smile, the way she'd looked at me in the firelight, it was all burned into my memory. I packed up my gear and headed back to civilization, telling myself I was being ridiculous. She was just a talented kid with stars in her eyes. I was a jaded old producer who'd seen it all. But as I drove back to Huntington Beach, I found myself fumbling for my phone, searching for her on social media. 2 days later, I was back in the studio, trying to focus on a mindless pop track when my assistant poked her head in. "There's a Sydney Garcia here to see you," she said. "Says you met at a campground?" My heart did a little somersault. I tried to play it cool as Sydney walked in, looking even more stunning in the harsh fluorescent lights of the studio. "I hope you don't mind me dropping by," she said a little nervously. I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation." I smiled, probably a bit too eagerly. "I'm glad you did. In fact, I've been thinking about you too. Your voice, I mean," I added quickly. "Have you ever considered recording an album?" Sydney's eyes widened. "Are you serious? I mean, I've dreamed about it, but nothing," I cut her off. "I want to produce your debut album. That is, if you're interested." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. We spent long hours in the studio working on Sydney's songs, refining her sound. I found myself looking forward to our sessions more than I had any project in years. There was something magical about watching Sydney come into her own as an artist. But it wasn't just her talent that drew me in. It was the way she'd bring me coffee just the way I liked it, or how she'd stick her tongue out slightly when she was concentrating hard on a difficult vocal run. It was the late-night conversations we'd have, sharing our hopes and fears, our triumphs and failures. One night, after a particularly grueling session, we were alone in the sound booth. Sydney had just finished a heart-wrenching ballad, and there were tears in her eyes. Without thinking, I reached out and wiped a tear from her cheek. "That was beautiful," I whispered. Sydney looked at me, her blue eyes intense. "Nora," she said softly, "I think I'm falling for you." Before I could respond, she leaned in and kissed me. It was soft at first, hesitant, but then it deepened into something more passionate. I felt like I was drowning and flying at the same time. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. "I'm sorry," Sydney stammered. "I shouldn't have." I cut her off with another kiss. "Don't you dare apologize," I murmured against her lips. From that moment on, everything changed. We tried to keep things professional in the studio, but stolen glances and accidental touches became the norm. After hours, we'd explore our newfound connection, sometimes talking until dawn, other times letting our bodies do the communicating. But as our relationship blossomed, so did Sydney's career. The rough cuts of her songs were generating serious buzz in the industry. A&R reps started showing up at the studio, and whispers of a bidding war for her first album began to circulate. I should have been thrilled. This was what we'd been working towards after all. But a nagging fear started to grow in the pit of my stomach. Sydney was on the cusp of stardom, her whole life ahead of her. And me? I was a middle-aged producer with more than a few miles on the odometer. One evening, as we were leaving the studio, I saw a sleek black car parked across the street. A man was leaning against it, his eyes fixed on Sydney. She tensed up when she saw him, her hand gripping mine tightly. "Who's that?" I asked, instantly on alert. Sydney's voice was barely above a whisper. "That's Marcus, my ex-boyfriend. I thought he'd finally given up." As Marcus started walking towards us, I could feel Sydney trembling beside me. I squeezed her hand reassuringly, but my mind was racing. I had a feeling our honeymoon phase was about to come to an abrupt end. Marcus sauntered towards us, a smarmy grin plastered on his face. I instinctively stepped in front of Sydney, my protective instincts kicking into overdrive. Well, Marcus drawled, his eyes flicking between us. "If it isn't my sweet Sydney and her, producer." He said the last word like it left a bad taste in his mouth. "What do you want, Marcus?" Sydney's voice was steady, but I could feel her trembling against my back. He held up his hands in mock surrender. "Can't a guy check in on his girl? You haven't been returning my calls, babe." "She's not your girl," I snapped, my patience wearing thin. "And she doesn't owe you anything. Now beat it." Marcus's eyes narrowed, all pretense of friendliness vanishing. "Watch yourself, Grandma. You don't know who you're dealing with." Before I could retort, Sydney grabbed my arm. "Let's just go, Nora, please." We hurried to my car, Marcus's laughter echoing behind us. As we drove away, I glanced at Sydney. She was pale, her hands clenched in her lap. "Want to talk about it?" I asked gently. She shook her head, then paused. "Not right now. Can I stay with you tonight?" I nodded, reaching over to squeeze her hand. That night, as Sydney curled up against me in bed, she finally opened up about Marcus. Their relationship had been toxic from the start. He was controlling, manipulative, and had a nasty jealous streak. When she'd finally worked up the courage to leave him, he'd stalked her for months. "I thought it was over," she whispered into the darkness. "I thought I was finally free." I held her tighter, rage boiling in my chest. "We'll figure this out," I promised. "Together." The next few days were tense. Marcus didn't show up at the studio again, but his presence loomed over us like a dark cloud. Sydney jumped at every unexpected noise, and her usual spark in the recording booth was dimmed. To take her mind off things, I suggested a weekend getaway. There was a little beachside B&B I knew, quiet and secluded. Sydney's face lit up at the idea, and for the first time in days, I saw a glimpse of the woman I'd fallen for. We left early Friday morning, windows down and music blasting. As we drove along the coast, I watched Sydney out of the corner of my eye. The wind whipped through her blonde hair, and she sang along to the radio, her voice carrying over the sound of the waves. The B&B was just as charming as I remembered. Our room had a balcony overlooking the ocean, and we spent the afternoon walking on the beach, collecting seashells and stealing kisses like teenagers. That evening, we had dinner at a little seafood place in town. The wine flowed freely, and by the time we stumbled back to our room, we were both pleasantly buzzed and handsy. As soon as the door closed behind us, Sydney pressed me against it, her lips finding mine in a heated kiss. I tangled my fingers in her hair, pulling her closer. We fumbled with buttons and zippers, leaving a trail of clothes from the door to the bed. What followed was a night of exploration and passion. Sydney's touch was electric, sending shivers down my spine. We took our time, savoring every moment, every sensation. As we lay tangled together afterward, breathless and satiated, I realized I was falling hard for this woman. The rest of the weekend passed in a blissful bubble. We barely left the room, ordering room service and spending hours talking, laughing, and making love. For those precious days, Marcus and all our worries seemed a world away. But reality came crashing back as soon as we returned to Huntington Beach. There was a message waiting for Sydney on the studio answering machine. "Did you really think you could hide from me?" Marcus's voice oozed through the speakers. "I know where you are, Sydney. I know what you're doing. And I know about your little hobby with the old lady. You better watch your step, babe. You wouldn't want anything to happen to your precious career, would you?" Sydney's face drained of color as she listened. When the message ended, she turned to me, her eyes wide with fear. "What are we going to do?" she whispered. I pulled her into a fierce hug, my mind already racing with possibilities. "We're going to fight back," I said firmly. "I'm not letting that bastard ruin what we have, or your career." But as I held Sydney, feeling her shake in my arms, I couldn't shake the sinking feeling that this was only the beginning. Marcus had thrown down the gauntlet, and I had a feeling things were about to get a whole lot worse before they got better. The next few weeks were a nightmare. Marcus's presence seemed to loom over every aspect of our lives. He never showed up at the studio again, but his shadow was everywhere. Sydney would receive cryptic text messages at all hours. Once she found a bouquet of wilted roses on her doorstep with a note that simply said, "Soon." I tried to keep Sydney focused on her music, but it was getting harder by the day. Her voice, once so vibrant and full of life, now sounded strained and fearful. Takes that would have been perfect before now required multiple attempts. I could see the light in her eyes dimming, and it broke my heart. "Maybe we should go to the police," I suggested one night as we lay in bed. Sydney curled tightly against me. She shook her head. "We don't have any proof. It'll be my word against his, and you know how these things usually go." I knew she was right, but the feeling of helplessness was eating me alive. I wanted to protect her, to make all of this go away, but I felt powerless. Things came to a head one afternoon during a recording session. Sydney was in the booth, struggling with a particularly emotional ballad. Take after take, something was off. I could see the frustration building in her eyes. "Let's take 5, I said into the mic. "Get some water, shake it off." Sydney nodded, pulling off her headphones. As she stepped out of the booth, her phone buzzed. The color drained from her face as she read the message. "What is it?" I asked, moving to her side. She wordlessly handed me the phone. There was a photo of us, clearly taken through a window, in an intimate moment. The caption read, "Tick-tock, babe, time's running out." Sydney's legs gave out, and I barely caught her before she hit the floor. She was hyperventilating, tears streaming down her face. I held her close, murmuring soothing words, but inside I was seething with rage. "That's it," I said, helping Sydney to her feet. "This ends now." I marched out of the studio, Sydney trailing behind me. The street was busy with the usual afternoon crowd, but I spotted him immediately. Marcus was leaning against his car across the street, that smug grin on his face. I stormed up to him, Sydney calling out behind me to stop, but I was beyond reason at this point. "Listen here, you little shit," I snarled, getting right in his face. "I don't know what sick game you think you're playing, but it stops now. You stay away from Sydney, you hear me?" Marcus's grin widened. "Or what, Grandma? You'll hit me with your walker?" I saw red. Before I knew what I was doing, my fist connected with his jaw. Marcus stumbled back, shock replacing his smug expression. "Nora!" Sydney cried out, grabbing my arm and pulling me back. A small crowd had gathered, murmuring and pointing. Marcus rubbed his jaw, his eyes blazing with fury. "You're gonna regret that," he spat, "both of you." He got in his car and peeled away, leaving us standing on the sidewalk surrounded by curious onlookers. The adrenaline drained from my body, leaving me shaky and nauseous. What had I done? I'd just assaulted someone in broad daylight, in front of witnesses. This was bad. This was very bad. Sydney tugged on my arm. "We need to get out of here," she said urgently. We hurried back to the studio, locking the door behind us. Sydney paced the room, running her hands through her hair. "What were you thinking?" she asked, her voice a mix of anger and fear. I slumped into a chair, the reality of what I'd done sinking in. I wasn't thinking. I just couldn't stand seeing him hurt you anymore. Sydney's expression softened. She knelt in front of me, taking my hands in hers. "I appreciate you wanting to protect me, but this isn't the way." I nodded, feeling utterly defeated. "I know, I'm sorry. I've probably just made everything worse." We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the situation pressing down on us. Finally, Sydney spoke. I think we need to separate for a while." The words hit me like a physical blow. "What?" "Sydney, no." She held up a hand, her eyes brimming with tears. "Just listen. Marcus is escalating, he's dangerous. And now, with what happened today, I'm afraid of what he might do. To you, to me, to your career." "I don't care about my career," I protested. "But I do," Sydney said firmly. "And I care about you. Too much to let you throw everything away because of me." I wanted to argue, to tell her we could face this together. But deep down, I knew she was right. Marcus had us backed into a corner, and we needed to regroup. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sydney shook her head. "I don't know. Until we figure out how to deal with Marcus. Until it's safe." She leaned in, pressing her forehead against mine. "This isn't goodbye," she murmured. "It's just intermission." I choked out a laugh that was dangerously close to a sob. "Promise?" "I promise," she said, sealing it with a kiss that tasted of tears and unspoken words. As I watched Sydney walk out of the studio, my heart feeling like it was being torn in two, I made a silent vow. I would find a way to end this, to keep her safe, no matter what it took. The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. The studio felt empty without Sydney's presence, her laughter no longer echoing off the walls. I threw myself into work, trying to fill the void she'd left behind, but nothing could quite dull the ache in my chest. We'd agreed to minimize contact for safety's sake, but we couldn't bear to cut ties completely. We developed a system of coded messages, hidden in plain sight on social media. A post about the weather might mean she was safe. A song lyric could be a call for help. It wasn't much, but it was a lifeline in the storm we were weathering. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself scrolling through Sydney's Instagram. Her latest post was a picture of a sunset with the caption, "Missing the melody of the waves." To anyone else, it would seem like a nostalgic vacation memory. But I knew better. It was our code for meeting at the beach where we'd spent that perfect weekend. My heart raced as I grabbed my keys and headed out. It was well past midnight, the streets of Huntington Beach nearly deserted. As I pulled up to the beach, I saw a lone figure standing at the water's edge, silhouetted against the moonlight. Sydney turned as I approached, her face lighting up with a smile that made my knees weak. "You came," she whispered, pulling me into a tight embrace. "Always," I murmured into her hair, breathing in her familiar scent. We stood there for a long moment, just holding each other, the sound of the waves providing a soothing backdrop. Finally, Sydney pulled back, her eyes searching mine. "I couldn't stay away any longer," she said. "I miss you so much, Nora." "I miss you too, sweetheart," I replied, cupping her face in my hands. "How are you holding up?" Sydney sighed, leaning into my touch. "It's been hard, but there's some good news. The album is generating a lot of buzz. The label wants to release the first single next month." I felt a surge of pride mixed with a twinge of sadness. Sydney's star was rising just as we'd hoped, but I wasn't there to share in her triumph. "That's fantastic, Sid," I said, forcing a smile. "I always knew you'd make it big." She must have sensed the conflict in my voice because she took my hand, squeezing it gently. "None of this would have happened without you, Nora. You're as much a part of this success as I am." We walked along the beach, talking in hushed tones about everything and nothing. Sydney filled me in on the latest developments with her career, and I shared some industry gossip. It almost felt normal, like we were just two lovers enjoying a moonlit stroll. But reality was never far away. As we neared a more populated area of the beach, Sydney tensed up, her eyes darting around nervously. "We should go," she said, her voice tight. "It's not safe to be out in the open like this." I nodded, though every fiber of my being rebelled against the idea of letting her go again. We made our way back to where we'd parked, lingering by our cars. "When can I see you again?" I asked, hating how desperate I sounded. Sydney bit her lip, a habit I found endearingly familiar. "I don't know, but soon, I hope. I can't keep doing this, Nora. Being apart, it's killing me." "Me too," I admitted. "We'll figure something out. I promise." She leaned in, kissing me with a passion that left me breathless. When we finally parted, there were tears in her eyes. "I love you," she whispered, the words sending a jolt through my system. It was the first time either of us had said it out loud. "I love you too," I replied, my voice thick with emotion. I watched her drive away, my heart both fuller and emptier than it had been in weeks. The next few days passed in a blur. I was so caught up in thoughts of Sydney and our clandestine meeting that I almost missed the news. It was my assistant who brought it to my attention, bursting into my office with wide eyes. "Have you seen this?" she asked, thrusting her phone at me. I took it, my blood running cold as I read the headline. "Rising star Sydney Garcia's steamy studio romance revealed." The article was full of grainy photos of Sydney and me, clearly taken without our knowledge. There were shots of us holding hands outside the studio, sharing intimate moments in restaurants. Even a blurry image from our beach rendezvous. The text was filled with salacious speculation about our relationship, painting it as a scandalous affair between an industry veteran and an up-and-coming artist. My first instinct was panic. This was exactly what we'd been trying to avoid. But as I read further, a spark of hope ignited in my chest. The public reaction in the comments section was overwhelmingly positive. People were calling it a beautiful love story, praising Sydney's bravery for being open about her sexuality. I grabbed my phone, my fingers shaking as I dialed Sydney's number. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again and again, growing more frantic with each unanswered call. Finally, after what felt like hours, my phone buzzed with a text from Sydney. 2 words that made my heart stop. "He knows." Those 2 words sent me into a panic. I tried calling Sydney again, but her phone was off. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. What if Marcus had her? What if he'd hurt her? I couldn't just sit here and do nothing. I grabbed my keys and bolted out of the studio, ignoring the concerned calls of my assistant. As I sped through the streets of Huntington Beach, I tried to think logically. Where would Sydney go? Where would she feel safe? Then it hit me, the campground where we first met. It was a long shot, but it was all I had. The drive felt endless, each minute stretching into an eternity. When I finally pulled into the campground, the sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. I scanned the area frantically, my heart pounding in my chest. And then I saw it. Sydney's beat-up old car, parked at a secluded spot near the edge of the grounds. I nearly tripped over my own feet in my rush to get to her. As I approached, I saw her sitting by a small fire, her knees drawn up to her chest. She looked up as I neared, her eyes red-rimmed and puffy. "Nora," she whispered, her voice weak with relief. "You found me." I dropped to my knees beside her, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Of course I found you," I murmured into her hair. "I'll always find you." We sat like that for a long moment, just holding each other. Finally, Sydney pulled back, wiping at her eyes. "He showed up at my apartment," she said, her voice shaky. "Marcus, he had printouts of all those photos. He was so angry, Nora. I've never seen him like that before." A surge of protective rage welled up inside me. "Did he hurt you?" I asked, my voice low and dangerous. Sydney shook her head. "No, not physically, but the things he said." She shuddered. "He threatened to ruin everything. My career, your reputation, all of it." I took her hands in mine, squeezing gently. "Listen to me, Sid. He can't ruin anything. Those photos? They're already out there. And you know what? People love it. They're calling it a beautiful love story." Sydney's eyes widened in surprise. "Really?" I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. "Really, the industry is rallying behind you, behind us." For the first time since I'd arrived, I saw a glimmer of hope in Sydney's eyes, but it quickly faded. "But what about Marcus?" she asked. "He's not going to stop, Nora. He's obsessed." I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I was about to suggest. "I think it's time we fight back. For real this time." Sydney looked at me quizzically. "What do you mean?" "I mean we gather evidence. Every threatening message, every unwanted gift, every time he's shown up uninvited. We document all of it and take it to the police." Sydney bit her lip, considering. "Do you really think that will work?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But I do know that I'm tired of living in fear, of watching you suffer. We have to try something." She nodded slowly, determination replacing the fear in her eyes. "Okay, let's do it." We spent the next few hours going through Sydney's phone, screenshotting every threatening text and email from Marcus. She told me about each encounter, each time he'd shown up uninvited, and I meticulously wrote it all down. As we worked, I could see Sydney's spirits lifting. There was something empowering about taking action, about fighting back instead of just hiding. It was well past midnight when we finally finished. The fire had died down to embers, casting a soft glow over our makeshift workspace. What now?" Sydney asked, stifling a yawn. "Now," I said, gathering up our evidence. "We get some rest, and tomorrow we go to the police." Sydney nodded, then hesitated. "Nora, will you stay with me tonight? I don't want to be alone." My heart swelled with love for this brave, beautiful woman. "Of course, sweetheart, always." We curled up together in the back of Sydney's car, a tangle of limbs and shared warmth. As Sydney drifted off to sleep, her head on my chest, I allowed myself to feel a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could put an end to this nightmare. The next morning, we drove to the police station, our file of evidence clutched tightly in my hands. The officer who took our statement seemed skeptical at first, but as we laid out the extent of Marcus's harassment, his expression grew more serious. "This is quite extensive," he said, flipping through our documentation. "We'll need to investigate further, but I think you have a strong case for a restraining order at the very least." Sydney's hand tightened around mine at those words. A restraining order. It wasn't a magic solution, but it was a start, a way to fight back. As we left the station, Sydney turned to me, her eyes shining with a mix of fear and determination. "What happens now?" she asked. I pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Now we wait. And we don't let Marcus win. You have an album to finish, remember?" A small smile tugged at Sydney's lips. "Will you help me? I don't think I can do this without you." "Wild horses couldn't drag me away," I promised. We walked hand in hand back to the car, ready to face whatever came next. Together. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and studio sessions. We threw ourselves into finishing Sydney's album, using the music as a refuge from the storm raging around us. The restraining order against Marcus was granted, but it felt like a flimsy shield against his obsession. The day the order was served, Sydney and I were in the studio, working on the final mix of her lead single. My phone buzzed with a text from our lawyer, confirming that Marcus had been officially notified. "It's done," I said, showing Sydney the message. She nodded, her face a mix of relief and apprehension. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" I wished I could give her a definitive yes, but we both knew better. "It's a start," I said instead, squeezing her hand. "Now, let's make you a star." We dove back into the music, losing ourselves in the rhythm and melody. Sydney's voice soared through the speakers, raw and powerful. As the final notes faded away, we looked at each other, a shared realization dawning. "That's it," I breathed. That's the one. Sydney's eyes widened. You really think so? I nodded, already reaching for the phone to call the label. Trust me, sweetheart, this is going to blow them away. The next day, we presented the finished album to the label executives. As the last track played out, the room was silent for a moment. Then, like a dam breaking, they erupted into applause. This is incredible, the head of A&R gushed. Sydney, you've got a voice that comes along once in a generation. We need to get this out there, now. Sydney beamed, her hand finding mine under the table. We'd done it. Despite everything, we'd created something beautiful. But our triumph was short-lived. As we left the label offices, riding high on our success, we were met with a sea of flashing cameras and shouting reporters. Sydney, is it true you're in a relationship with your producer? Nora, how do you respond to accusations of taking advantage of a young artist? Sydney, what about the restraining order against your ex-boyfriend? We froze, overwhelmed by the onslaught. I instinctively moved to shield Sydney, but she surprised me by stepping forward, her chin raised defiantly. Yes, she said, her voice clear and strong. Nora and I are in a relationship. She is the most talented, compassionate person I know, and I'm proud to be with her. The reporters went wild, shouting more questions. But Sydney wasn't done. As for the restraining order, yes, it's true. My ex-boyfriend has been harassing me, and we've taken legal action to protect ourselves. I won't let fear or prejudice dictate my life or my music. She turned to me, her eyes shining with determination. Nora, do you have anything to add? For a moment, I was speechless, in awe of this incredible woman beside me. Then I found my voice. Only that I'm the luckiest person in the world to be part of Sydney's journey, both personally and professionally. Her talent speaks for itself, and I'm honored to help bring her music to the world. We pushed our way through the crowd, ignoring the continued barrage of questions. Once we were safely in the car, Sydney let out a shaky laugh. Gosh, I can't believe I just did that, she said, running a hand through her hair. I leaned over and kissed her, pouring all my love and pride into it. You were amazing, I murmured against her lips. The next few days were chaos. Our impromptu press conference was all over the news and social media. Opinion pieces debated the ethics of our relationship, while music blogs buzzed with anticipation for Sydney's album. But amidst the storm, something unexpected happened. Support started pouring in from all corners of the industry. Other LGBTQ artists reached out, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. Fans flooded Sydney's social media with messages of love and acceptance. One evening, as we sat on my couch scrolling through the seemingly endless stream of supportive comments, Sydney turned to me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I never thought it could be like this, she said softly. I was so scared of being out, of people knowing the real me. But now? I pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. Now they see you for the incredible person you are. She snuggled into my side, a contented sigh escaping her lips. Thank you, Nora, for everything, for believing in me, for standing by me. Always, I promised, my heart swelling with love. The day of the album release arrived in a flurry of interviews and promotional appearances. Sydney was a natural, charming interviewers and audiences alike with her honesty and humor. I watched from the sidelines, bursting with pride. As the first day's sales figures rolled in, it became clear we had a hit on our hands. Sydney's single shot to the top of the charts, and the album was being hailed as a breakthrough debut. We celebrated that night with a small gathering of close friends and industry supporters. As Sydney made a heartfelt speech thanking everyone for their support, her eyes found mine in the crowd. The love and gratitude I saw there took my breath away. Later, as we slow danced in a quiet corner, Sydney leaned in close. I want to dedicate the album to you, she whispered. To us. I pulled back slightly, surprised. Are you sure? You don't think it's too much? She shook her head, a soft smile playing on her lips. It's perfect. You're my midnight melody, remember? I laughed, remembering our first night by the campfire. How could I forget? As we swayed to the music, surrounded by people who supported and celebrated our love, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. We'd faced our fears. stood up to our demons, and come out stronger on the other side. The road ahead might not be easy, but with Sydney by my side, I was ready for anything. 6 months after the release of Sydney's debut album, we found ourselves back in Huntington Beach, this time house hunting. The success of Midnight Melodies had exceeded even our wildest expectations, and Sydney was now a bona fide star. We'd decided it was time to put down some roots, to create a space that was truly ours. As we walked hand in hand along the beach, Sydney pointed excitedly at a beautiful beachfront property. "Look, Nora, it's perfect." I laughed, pulling her close. "Slow down, superstar. We haven't even seen inside yet." But as soon as we stepped through the front door, I knew she was right. The open-plan living area faced the ocean, huge windows letting in streams of golden California sunshine. I could already picture us here, Sydney strumming her guitar as I tinkered with mixes on my laptop, the sound of the waves providing the perfect backdrop. We made an offer that day, and a month later, we were moving in. As we unpacked boxes and argued good-naturedly about where to hang artwork, I marveled at how far we'd come. The music industry had embraced us wholeheartedly. Our relationship, once a source of fear and secrecy, was now celebrated as a symbol of love conquering all. We'd become unexpected advocates for LGBTQ rights in the industry, using our platform to push for greater representation and acceptance. Marcus had faded into the background, the restraining order and public scrutiny finally forcing him to back off. Sometimes I still caught Sydney looking over her shoulder, old habits dying hard, but those moments were becoming fewer and farther between. One evening, as we sat on our new balcony watching the sunset, Sydney turned to me with a mischievous glint in her eye. "So," she said, trying and failing to keep a straight face, "I've been thinking about my next album." I raised an eyebrow, playing along. "Oh, and what brilliant ideas has that beautiful mind of yours come up with?" She bit her lip, suddenly looking nervous. "Well, I was thinking, maybe we could write it together, as partners in every sense of the word." My heart skipped a beat. We'd collaborated before, of course, but this felt different. This felt like a new beginning. "I'd be honored," I said, leaning in to kiss her softly. The next few months were a whirlwind of creativity. We set up a small studio in the house, spending long nights crafting melodies and lyrics. Our different styles and experiences blended beautifully, creating something truly unique. As we worked, our relationship deepened. The shared passion, the late-night brainstorming sessions, the thrill of creating something together, it all served to bring us even closer. One night, as we put the finishing touches on what we both agreed was the album's standout track, Sydney turned to me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I never thought I could be this happy," she said softly. "You've given me everything, Nora. A career, a home, a love I never thought I deserved." I cupped her face in my hands, overwhelmed by the depth of my feelings for this incredible woman. "You've given me just as much, sweetheart. You brought the music back into my life when I thought I'd lost it forever." We stood there for a long moment, foreheads pressed together, basking in the love we'd found against all odds. The day we presented the new album to the label was nerve-wracking. We'd poured our hearts and souls into every track, and the thought of someone not understanding our vision was terrifying. But we needn't have worried. As the last notes faded away, the room erupted into applause. The label exec wiped away a tear, shaking his head in amazement. "This is extraordinary," he said. "You've outdone yourselves. This isn't just an album, it's a love story set to music." Sydney beamed at me, squeezing my hand under the table. We'd done it, together. The album release party was a star-studded affair, but all I could focus on was Sydney. She was radiant, working the room with ease, her laughter carrying over the buzz of conversation. As she took to the stage to perform our lead single, her eyes found mine in the crowd. "This song is dedicated to my partner, my lover, my midnight melody," she said into the microphone, her voice full of emotion. "Nora, this is for you." As the first chords rang out, I felt tears prick at my eyes. The lyrics we'd written together washed over me, a testament to our journey, our love, our shared passion for music. Later that night, as we slow danced in our living room, the sound of the waves mixing with the soft strains of our album playing in the background, Sydney looked up at me with those piercing blue eyes that had captivated me from the start. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing in me, for loving me, for being my home." I pulled her closer, overwhelmed by the love I felt for this woman. "Always," I murmured into her hair. "You and me, Sid, always." As we swayed to the music we'd created together, I knew with absolute certainty that this was where I belonged. In this house by the sea, with the love of my life in my arms and our music filling the air. We'd faced our fears, weathered the storms, and come out stronger on the other side. And now, here we were, living our dream. Two women in love, making music, changing the world in our own small way. As Sydney's lips met mine in a tender kiss, I smiled against her mouth. This was more than a happy ending. This was a beautiful beginning.